His recent articles and chapters, co-authored with John Sillito, include We Are Not Seeking Trouble and So We'll Go Along Quietly Just Now, the IWW's 1913 free speech fight in Salt Lake City, and Our Political Faith in Socialism. Our religious faith is in the Latter-day Saints, socialist Mormons and their millennial vision in the early 20th century. John Sillito earned undergraduate degrees in both history and political science and a master's degree in history from the University of Utah. His professional experience includes serving on the board of editors for the Utah Historical Quarterly, assistant records manager at the University of Utah, senior cataloger for the LDS Church Historical Department, and for 33 years, archivist and curator of special collections and professor of libraries at Weber State University. He has won several awards. Weber State College's Nye Honors Professor, the Utah State Historical Society's Nick Yangich Memorial Award, the Mormon History Association's Best Documentary in Mormon History, and Weber State University's Utah International Fellow. He's published a number of books and articles. In addition to A History of Utah Radicalism, he wrote History's Apprentice, The Diaries of B.H. Roberts, and co-edited A World We Thought We Knew, Readings in Utah History. Among the articles he has published are Our Tone, Tony Lazzari's Baseball Career in Salt Lake City, 1922 to 25, The Making of an Insurgent, Parley P. Christensen in Utah Politics, 1900 to 1912, Women in the Socialist Party in Utah, 1900 to 1920, and with John McCormick, Socialists in Power, The Eureka Utah Experience, and Socialist Saints, Mormons in the Socialist Party. Please join me in welcoming John and John today. To being asked to introduce them, I've been asked to moderate this discussion. So, but I'm not greedy. We will save plenty of time for discussions after our conversation. But first, John would like to say something.
I'd like to take a moment of personal privilege, if I could. We're going to be talking about dissent and dissenters and free speech. We lost an important defender of free speech earlier this month, Brian Bernard. And I hope we will keep him in our memories and realize that free speech is important and it needs its defenders, and Brian was that. So I'm going to miss him, but I'm happy that I had the opportunity to spend some time with him, and his impact on this state is major. So thank you.
John, would you just give a little more information about him?
Brian was an attorney here in Salt Lake. He had the Utah Legal Clinic, worked for the ACLU, and made it his point to defend anybody that was that needed free speech defense, and that ran the gamut from Mormon fundamentalists to Native Americans to prisoners at the state penitentiary. If somebody had an unpopular case, Brian was there to take it. The IWW could have used him in 1909.
That's right. Yeah.
So thank you.
Okay, I have a question. I think to start with, what was it that interested the two of you in this theme, in this project, and for a long time?
Well, I speak for myself here. I first encountered the Socialist Party more than 40 years ago as an undergraduate student here at the University of Utah. I took classes from both Frank Jonas in the political science department. I wrote my first paper on independent politics for Jonas. I also worked with Alan Coombs in the history department. I discovered early on I got better grades in history than political science, so I shifted from poli-sci to history. I did my master's thesis on a guy named Parley P. Christensen, who was another Utah attorney who was the presidential nominee of the Farmer Labor Party. At about the same time, I read a book called The Decline of Socialism in America, written by a man named James Weinstein. And I was convinced, based on what I had studied and what I had read, that there was some other political tradition than the two-party system, than the two major parties, and those folks had contested for power too. That's what began. After that, I discovered that not only was this a political movement, but in many ways a cultural movement.
You know, I think I've tried to think about this question too. When did I first become interested in the radical political tradition and radical political movements, and why? When and why did I get interested? I think it probably goes back to my graduate experience at the University of Iowa. I went back there to study intellectual history with a man named Stowe Persons, who was an old lefty himself, but I quickly ran into another historian, a man named Peter Larmer, who was a Marxist, and very thoughtful, and in some ways charismatic in his teaching, and so I was exposed to a point of view that, for whatever reason, increasingly resonated with me. You know, so that when Larmer and others, and it wasn't just Larmer, it was a whole generation of students, because I was back at Iowa in the late 60s, early 70s, and was, you know, at the height of the anti-war movement and, you know, the tumult of the 60s, and Iowa was a very activist campus, and so I found that the point of view that the United States was in crisis, political, economic, cultural crisis, and that the reason was because of the nature of the existing economic system. It wasn't just that small changes within the existing system could be made. It wasn't enough to rearrange the deck chairs on the Titanic. The point of view that, in fact, what was necessary was the replacement of the existing system with a very different kind of system. That idea resonated with me, as I say, and then, like John, I began to realize that that was a point of view, that kind of point of view had long existed throughout American history. You know, that every generation had its radical movement or political movements. And then I can't remember when I first began to realize that that was true for Utah as well. You know, that Utah had a radical political tradition. But when I did, it didn't correspond with what I thought I knew. And actually that's the significance of the title of that collection of readings that John and I edited, A World We Thought We Knew. The world we thought we knew, in fact, turns out to be quite a different world than that. And then once I'm in Utah, back in Utah, working in Utah, living in Utah, it made sense, I thought, to undertake a project investigating the radical political tradition in Utah. I mean, honestly, if I kept living in Iowa, or I taught for a couple of years in Texas. If I taught in Texas, I would have wanted to investigate radical political movements in those places.
Let me just add one thing to what John said that dovetails. What I discovered growing up in that same period of the 60s and the early 70s is there was a radical movement here in Utah. And people came into that movement. Sometimes they stayed a long time. Sometimes they kind of passed through going elsewhere. And what I found is that had been true in the 1930s with folks who were attracted to the Communist Party, in the hundreds of thousands, most of whom never stayed in the party. And then I discovered that in the early 20th century, there were people that came into the Socialist Party. Again, many of them stayed for a long time. Many others simply went through that. But the experience of the 60s, the 30s, the early 20th century, whether people stayed or they just went through quickly, somehow resonated with them and stuck with them as they approached the rest of their political and indeed their cultural life. So I think that growing up then made it easier to appreciate people who challenged the status quo, for me at least.
Yeah, me as well, sure.
Okay, great. I think it's important to define what you mean by radicalism, because some scholars have called it a rather unwieldy subject, and some see it as disparate sort of patchwork movements that are loosely connected because of dissent or anti-authoritarianism, something like that, while others might describe it as a substantive tradition, perhaps even linear. How do you define radicalism? What does it mean to you?
Yeah, well, you know, let me just say something, and John could pick up on that if he wants, or Marianne. well, first of all, it's not an easy subject necessarily, or term to define, and we define it for purposes of our study and book in a fairly expansive way. So what we say, first of all, we're interested in left-wing, not right-wing radicalism. I would say the current Tea Party movement is a radical movement, but it's a right-wing movement, and that's worthy of study. But we leave the study of right-wing radicalism to somebody else. We say our focus in this book is on movements that, first of all, call for thoroughgoing change in the way society was organized and structured and operated, as opposed to making small adjustments in the way things are. But secondly, radical movements that emphasized inclusion and redistribution, seeking to enlarge rather than restrict the sphere of freedom and opportunity. And so for us, the focus of this book is the Socialist Party of America in the early 20th century, but we put that in the context of previous radical movements, and then we discuss briefly at the end of the book radical movements since then. And all of the movements we discuss that we define as radical, I hope we intend, fit under that definition.